All right, ladies and gents, welcome back. Thanks for coming out on a rainy day. This is the first of the executive lecture series for the spring. Housekeeping items, if you're signing in, the barcodes are up front. There's also a couple of them in the back on the back door. Today we have an unusual guest. So Jessica runs a nonprofit in Lancaster in Lebanon. She's not your typical business leader, but she certainly is an executive. And her path fits very well with our motto, educate for service. So for those of you who are thinking about things you're passionate about, nonprofits and how people end up where they end up, I'm sure she'll be a good example for you to follow. So treat her nice, ask a lot of questions, and I'll let her do the rest.
Sure. Let's see if we get started here. Hi, everyone. How y'all doing? Good. All right. I am Jessica Laspino. I'm the executive director of CASA of Lancaster and Lebanon counties. And I'm just going to talk a little bit, I think, about certainly CASA, what it is we do, how we do what we do, and why we do it. But first, I'm going to talk just a little bit about me, if you'll indulge me, and kind of how I wandered into this role. So I majored in English, which is not a typical major for running an organization, nor did I major in social work, which is often assumed when people find out what I do. But I majored in English because I went to college. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I knew I loved reading, and there I wandered into that major. And I fell in love with it. It taught me a lot about critical thinking, how to write effectively, how to communicate effectively, and how to interpret different situations. I did for a short time double major in elementary education because I thought if I was going to major in English, I might as well teach. At the time, at my school, Mary Washington College, in order to major in elementary education, you had to agree to stay a fifth year and get your master's. There was no undergrad degree. And that at the time sounded like the worst idea. I just wanted to finish college and go live my life. So I withdrew from that program and just left with a degree in English. I then joined a program called AmeriCorps. Is anyone familiar with that? Okay, this is good. AmeriCorps is most succinctly and easily described as the Peace Corps in the United States. There's a couple different branches. The one that I joined was the NCCC, the National Civilian Community Corps. It is throughout the US. There are 5 campuses in the US. I was based out of Denver, Colorado, and then kind of divided in the central region of the United States. And what AmeriCorps and NCCC is you are assigned to a team and you travel with that team for 4 6 to 8 week projects. They're all direct service. And they really test you, and that's where I grew a lot. So my first project was in a small town in Missouri. We were doing prairie restoration. And what that means is we were all chainsaw certified, and we cut down the invasive trees throughout the prairies. And then we put on our Kevlar, and we did controlled burns over hundreds of acres of prairie. So that was kind of the fun side of the service work for that first project. The challenging side, and where I learned a lot about myself, was the team aspect. You travel, live with your teammates, who are about 8 to 10 folks between the ages of 18 and 24, and you don't get to choose your team at all. So you are forced to engage with and become colleagues and friends with people who probably never otherwise would have crossed your circle of influence. And it teaches you an incredible amount about yourself, your boundaries, and how to get to know other people. I finished my first year in AmeriCorps, did a variety of other projects. We're also trained with Red Cross and FEMA and disaster relief, so we responded to hurricanes in Florida. And I loved that experience so much. I went back a second year and served as a team leader. And that is essentially the same thing, except you are now the individual who's leading a group of 8 to 10, 18 to 24-year-olds through their service year. And that was really my first experience with leadership in that capacity, because the program is designed that the Corps members look to their team leader for everything. So we taught them how to drive 15 passenger vans and cargo vehicles. We taught them how to put snow chains on tires. We budgeted for trips. We planned meals. But all of a sudden, with not a lot of training myself, except having done it 1 year, I was supposed to know everything about everything. Where the closest ATM was in Miami, Florida, you know, how far it was until our next rest stop, anything. And so I learned during that course of the year that I didn't want to be the leader that held all the information. I rather wanted folks to figure stuff out on their own. And so we started developing, I worked with my core members to develop some skills around, if you're having an issue with a team member, you need to bring me 2 to 3 solutions as opposed to just expecting me to solve it. If you want to know where the closest ATM is, we're going to have to break out the map. I know I'm dating myself, but that's okay. And find the localist convenience store. After I served my 2nd year with AmeriCorps, I got a job at a CASA organization in Atlantic and Cape May counties. And I'm going to talk about what CASA does in a minute. But you should all know that I only applied to that CASA program in Southern Jersey because I grew up in North Jersey and wanted to live at the beach. That is literally the only reason I applied for my first job with CASA. And just personally, I've been married for nearly 15 years with 2 kids. And that comes into play because that impacts my leadership. So what does through it all mean when I talk about leading a nonprofit? It means through having my 2 kids, leading an organization that's dependent on the donations of others through some economic recessions, working on building staffing and increasing funding, and of course, the pandemic. So, CASA of Lancaster and Lebanon counties. This is our mission and vision. Most simply, we recruit, train, and supervise members from the community who are then appointed by a judge to advocate on behalf of the best interest of a child who has suffered abuse and neglect to the point where he or she is no longer safe in their own home and they are placed into foster care. Our hope is, of course, that we can somehow insert ourselves, breaking that cycle and helping the larger community realize a vision where there is no longer abuse and neglect of kids. Now, that you know a little bit about CASA as a whole here, my first job as an entry-level case supervisor in Atlantic and Cape May County. So I supervised volunteers, the advocates, in their work. And I fell in love with the mission of CASA my first week of my job in Atlantic and Cape May. I went to court for observation, and there was a hearing. It's called a termination of parental rights hearing, a TPR. And during that hearing, the judge is ruling on whether or not the parents have had enough time to address the abuse and neglect issues, and if the child is better suited to have that relationship legally severed and be adopted. I sat in the back of the court. It was a 15-year-old girl and her mom. There was not a CASA on the case. And they were detailing mom's struggle with some mental health issues, some substance use disorders, and how she was unable to continue to care for her child. And so the judge was ruling in favor of terminating mom's parental rights to her kid. Mom was crying and the youth was crying. And then I started crying. It was incredibly difficult to watch a family be severed legally and also watch a 15-year-old girl look somewhat lost and confused. She didn't seem to have anyone really explaining to her what was going on or how this was going to impact things in the future. And it was then that I really saw the importance of CASA. So I worked at Atlantic and Cape May counties for about 3.5 years. First as a case supervisor, which is an entry-level position in most CASA organizations. And then eventually as a community outreach and training coordinator. So I oversaw some of our funding requests and the training of our advocates. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then eventually moved up one more level. So CASA, in order to become a CASA, You have to be at least 21 years of age. And then you come in to our organization through an information session to learn a little bit more. And once you're accepted, there's about an hour and a half interview with 2 of our staff members. We get references. You need to have all your child abuse clearances. And then you go through about a 35 to 40 hour training with some of my staff. After all of that, you are sworn in by one of our county dependency judges. And then you are available to be appointed to a child or a sibling group. And as a CASA, what we tell our volunteers is your first job is to get to know the child. So you go out and meet with that child wherever he or she is placed. And for a lot of our youth, that could be resource homes in the county. For some of our older youth who may have some additional barriers to success, their own juvenile charges, their own mental health complications, they may be placed at facilities as far as away as Erie or Pittsburgh. And our volunteers drive out to see them on a regular basis. Then we say you work outwards. So you get to know the child's resource parents, foster parents, the child's biological family members. And depending on the child's age and needs, you talk with the child's doctors, teachers, therapists, and you bring all this factual observation and conversation into a written report that we submit prior to each court hearing. And then our advocates are also available to testify as to what they feel is in the child's best interest. And then the judge makes a ruling and we come back again in 3 to 6 months. We ask our advocates for a commitment of 1 case, and that can be anywhere from 18 to 24 months. We do unfortunately have some cases that are in their 8 to 10 years, depending on the child's needs and behaviors and permanency. Our goal is to help facilitate a safe, permanent, and loving forever home for every child for whom we advocate. Ideally, that's going home. If that's not possible, it's adoption. And if a child doesn't want to be adopted and they're older, it's helping them age out to be as successful as they can be. So after I'd worked at CASA of Atlantic and Cape May counties for about 3.5 years, and I should pause here. CASA nationally started in Seattle, Washington in 1977. There was a family court judge there, Judge David Sukop, who presided over cases of abuse and neglect. And when he looked out into his courtroom, he saw attorneys, caseworkers, everybody who typically belongs in a dependency hearing with stacks of files. And he realized that there was no one speaking exclusively for the best interest of the child who knew the child really well. And so he put out a plea to his community and asked for community members to stand up and speak up for a child in the foster care system. He did his own little screening, his own little vetting, and he started appointing them to youth on his docket, on his caseload. And what he found was that community members' perspective, that kind of common sense one-on-one focus on a child, was integral in helping to inform his decisions. And that's how the CASA program was born initially. Then they slowly started spreading across the country and having their own affiliate programs. What might be interesting to you all, I think most of you are business majors, is National CASA as an association became an association after there were local programs. And so it's kind of been an ongoing growth issue, I guess, that you have a national organization kind of trying to gather people under when organizations, individual affiliates were operating prior to that national organization. CASA of Lancaster County was founded in the fall of 2009 officially. They had started trying to build a program here since about 2005. The president judge of Lancaster County Court at the time, Judge Farina, had known of successful CASA programs next door in York County, in Cumberland County, and didn't know why the youth in foster care in Lancaster County didn't have a CASA. So he asked Judge Leslie Gorby to spearhead a steering committee. Hold on. Of child welfare and legal professionals across the county to investigate whether or not a CASA program would be beneficial and possibly successful in Lancaster County. It was no surprise that youth in foster care in Lancaster were just as much in need of a personal advocate as youth in foster care across the country. So they did the initial funding. They applied for our 501c3, our federal nonprofit status. They got initial recognition from the National CASA organization, and then they started looking for an executive director. My husband and I loved South Jersey, but we're ready to leave kind of the transient vacation population of the Jersey Shore. And so it was actually a colleague at the time who saw this opening and suggested I apply. I never really thought that I would get this job because I hadn't worked through all the levels at my initial organization. But I was incredibly lucky to be hired as the first ED of CASA of Lancaster County at the time. And then first ED and only staff member. So for about a year, it all kind of came back to me. I had to do the public speaking, the recruitment of volunteers, the screening of volunteers, the 40-hour training of volunteers, and then eventually the fundraising and grant writing, the development side of an organization. We have such a great community in Lancaster County that we trained and swore in our first class on November 11th, 2009, and we were appointed to our first case on January 21st, 2010. I also was able to initially secure the funding to start building my team, which was key. So my first hire was a case supervisor, similar to how I had started. And they were able to take over the supervision of the volunteers so that I could focus on continuing to build the funding and the community relations of the organization. So 2010 to now, we now have 11 staff members. We've advocated for just over 1,000 children throughout the years. And of those, we've helped facilitate a safe permanent home for just over or just under 1,000 of those kids. In 2020, at the height of the pandemic, and I'm going to blame the fact that we were all working from home, we decided to buy a building and expand into Lebanon County. So in 2021, we officially became CASA of Lancaster and Lebanon counties, so that we are serving both children in Lancaster and then expanded our geographic footprint to encompass Lebanon County as well. So I want to talk a little bit about, these are highlights from last year, but previous to that, during the pandemic, we really struggled, like a lot of organizations, but we struggled also because one of the key cornerstones of our advocacy program is the ability for CASAs to see the child in their home, to get, whether it's their home of origin or whether it's their resource home or it's a facility. And that obviously, at least for the immediately following March, was not an option. It's also a good time to say that our volunteer population is majority, not exclusively, but majority retired. And so generationally, technology has a different impact on them than it certainly does on you. And I like to think I fall somewhere in the middle. But asking a 65, 75-year-old to set up a Zoom account or to do video time with their kids so that they could at least see them and talk to them created additional barriers, both for my staff to be able to support the advocates and for the advocates to be able to support their youth. And then we were also working through a court that was shut. And how did we help achieve timely permanency when they were initially unable to hold in-person hearings? I have to say our volunteers stepped up in incredible ways. They accessed virtual story times at libraries across the country. They took their kids on walking tours of their farms so they could meet their horses. They did an exceptional job continuing their advocacy. And then as additional guidance from the CDC and the state came out, we were able to best support our advocates in some safe in-person interactions and subsequent advocacy. So, but when we first initially shut down, the board of directors and I sat to develop what we called a flexible 18-month strategic plan. So for us, a strategic plan guides all of our goals for a certain period, we tend to do a 3-year strategic plan. So we set ultimate 3-year goals and then measured outcomes and how we're going to achieve those over 3 years. And those goals are typically around growth of the program. How many new advocates do we need to train? How many more children can we serve? Fundraising for the program and overall sustainability. So we had to kind of take a big step back and think about how this was going to impact everything. Not only our ability to provide services, but quite bluntly, our ability to stay afloat. As a nonprofit, our nonprofit is funded entirely on donations, special events, and grant writing. We are one of the nonprofits that receive no dedicated state, county, or federal funding. So everything we do is dependent on the ability to raise those funds. And it felt a little awkward to be asking for funds to continue to provide our services when you have a country under the layered trauma and repercussions of a pandemic. And so we were weighing all of that about how we were going to continue along and still provide our service. Again, we have some incredibly supportive community members. And with that in our advocate population, we were able to kind of continue to do what we were doing and do it well. As I mentioned, while we were home, we came across a building for sale in Lancaster County that seemed so serendipitously perfect, we decided to put in an offer. And we managed in 2021 to pull together a really rapid capital campaign, excuse me, which is specific to building purchases. And we purchased our office building and then expanded our reach into Lebanon County. So just in 2022 alone, we were able to serve 268 children with 167 CASAs. And that is both in Lancaster and Lebanon. These were our strategic imperatives for 2022 through 2025. So we came off our 18-month bridge plan, which got us through the pandemic successfully, and then some, quite frankly, and then looked at the key areas that we wanted to focus on moving forward. So first and foremost is providing a volunteer advocate for every child in need in Lancaster and Lebanon County. And the need is determined by the judiciary who presides over dependency cases. Increasing the diversity and cultural dexterity of our board and our volunteer advocate population. Children of color are overrepresented in the child welfare system, and advocates of color are underrepresented in our volunteer population, as well as in our staff and our board. And so if we are going to have a volunteer population that can truly best advocate for every child in need in Lancaster County, we need to have a volunteer population that mirrors back to the kids that we're serving. So that is something that we're continuing to work on. Also to expand our organizational capacity, and that looks at the infrastructure of the organization. Certainly purchasing a building was a huge first step, but then you have the IT infrastructure, as well as putting funding back into our team so that they can continue to get the education training they need to be as effective as they possibly can be in their roles. And then always increasing the financial sustainability of the program, making sure that we have the funding to expand, to sustain our current operations, and ideally to put into an ongoing money market account so that we always have the backup should we need it. Does anybody have any questions? Excellent. Feel free to throw your hand up or just yell out. So this is a quote from one of our CASAs. We thought it was just a really good way of putting into, I guess, just hearing it from the people who are doing it. And I loved her use of common thread because I think that's one of the most integral things that our CASAs can offer to a youth. So as I mentioned in 2022, we advocated for 268 children. 83 of those children were newly appointed to our program, either in Lancaster or Lebanon counties. And 96 of those, ultimately, we helped to facilitate that permanent home for those youth, whatever was in that child's best interest. We recruited and trained 34 new advocates. And altogether, they donated just over 6,000 hours of advocacy for their youth. I think we have miles driven here too. Yep. So they visited their CASA youth over 900 times. Collectively, our CASAs went to over 600 hearings at the court, and they drove more than 47,000 miles. And that, I can promise you, is underreported because most of our CASAs who drive within the county or neighboring counties don't track their mileage. It's our CASAs who are driving out to Pittsburgh and Erie and such who remember to kind of keep track of that. These are some of our events from the year, and I bring these up because this is where a lot of our funding comes from. So our Community Awareness Day, that is one of our advocates and one of the youth for whom she advocated. She came and spoke about the impact that her CASA had and how she was able to help her finish out high school and apply for college. And the Community Awareness Day is geared towards anybody who's interested in learning more about CASA. It is typically a free lunch or a free breakfast. And they hear about our program, they hear about someone who's been directly impacted by it. And then there is a call to action and ask to financially support us or to give us time through volunteering or a connection to another service. As you can see, in May of this year, we dedicated the building that we purchased in 2021. And those were two of the key supporters who helped provide the capital campaign matching fund. So together they put up $100,000 and we were able to match that in order to begin the purchase of our building. September 10th, this is our biggest fundraiser of the year. It's our Heroes Gala and Benefit Auction. It is, we raise money specifically through sponsorships of the event, through ticket sales for the event, and then through items that are donated to the organization or auctioned off, both silent and live. And then at the end, we do a paddle raise where people are able to just give directly to the organization. So this raised us just under $180,000, but we do have to pay to put it on. So we netted about 135 from this, but it's one of our most significant fundraisers. So our objectives for 2022 were to, and these are, you'll recognize a lot of these from those original strategic imperatives, remain relevant and grounded in the needs of our increasingly diverse constituents, both our CASAs and the youth whom we advocate for, as well as a changing judiciary, and cultivate sustainable financial resources and partnerships focusing on fundraising of those individual, major, and corporate gifts. This is where our income came from last year. So when you're starting a nonprofit, almost all of your funding will typically come from grants because you're beginning. A lot of foundations like to fund kind of the new idea in the community, and you don't have the personal relationships to depend heavily on corporate gifts, major gifts, and individual contributions. Studies would show that in order to be a long-term financially successful nonprofit, you need to shift your income to the individual donor. Individual donors are what is actually going to sustain a nonprofit. And so I was over 10 years, we've shifted from, I would say in 2010, probably 96% dependent on grants to just under 50%. And then you can see what comes from the individual contributions, just under 20%, as well as corporate investments and major gifts, and then community organizations and faith-based. And those are typically what I call third-party fundraisers, where a company or an organization's way of giving back is to do the heavy lift of an event. So they might do a golf tournament, they might do a 5K, and they put all of their time and resources into making that event successful, and then turn the proceeds over to the nonprofit. The flip of that is our expenses. This is something nonprofits are heavily kind of audited, looked at, is they want to know how much of like each dollar goes to program services and what goes to overhead. So we are just about 85% pure program services, and then administratively just under 6%, and fundraising just over 9%. And so that's a pretty good percentage to be able to talk about when we talk to funders and donors about the impact of their gift. Any questions? All right. So if we're looking at 2023 from 2022, we are looking at both our internal data, which we are showing a large increase in the number of older youth who are being referred for CASAs. So we are able to advocate for youth ages 0 to 21. And some of our youth who choose to stay in care even longer, we can continue to advocate for those folks. But we are seeing a stark increase in youth ages 14 and older. And that poses a couple complicating factors for our volunteers, because in Pennsylvania, at the age of 14, you can consent to your own mental health treatment, and you can also indicate whether or not you wish to be adopted. And so for some of our youth who are struggling with mental health, they choose not to continue their treatment, and it becomes increasingly difficult to find placements that are suited for them and help them reach their long-term goals. And then we also have a population of youth who understandably don't want to be adopted. And so that advocate's job then is to help prepare them to be as successful as they possibly can be when they leave care. Youth can sign themselves out of care at the age of 18. Most do, because I'm sure, as you all know, it feels like you're moving on to the next phase of your life. We try to help encourage our youth to stay in care as long as they can, because they gain access to additional resources. But I will tell you, there's probably no stricter parent than the local government. And so a lot of youth don't want to stay in. The other thing is, I talked about trying to increase our population of advocates to better represent the population of advocates we serve. We fell grossly short of this goal in 2022. So we've kind of recommitted, and we're adjusting some of our recruitment methods and some of our screening methods, but we have a predominantly white female advocate population that does not reflect back the boys that we advocate for, nor the youth of color. And so we are looking at trying to reach out to those populations so that we can provide better advocacy for youth in care. The last big opportunity is Lebanon County. Because it's a new county for us, we're only serving 3% of the youth in Lebanon versus about 60% of the youth in Lancaster. And so that's probably one of our biggest opportunities for growth moving into 2023. And I think, so these are things that I kind of, when I sat down, kind of wished I had known as I started into this leadership role and what I've learned. So the first is the importance of a mentor, and sometimes multiple mentors. So my very first mentor was my executive director at CASA of Atlantic and Cape May counties, Angie. And I'm lucky that she remains a good friend today. But Angie was the one who hired me. And then Angie honestly was the one who saw, I guess she saw, potential to help me kind of advance through the organization. So I was a case supervisor, and then the training and outreach coordinator. That wasn't really a position. I went to talk to Angie and said, I love what I do, but I think I could do more. And she said, absolutely, let's create a position. What do you like doing? What do you like doing best? And I said, well, I like facilitating training, and I like recruiting new volunteers. She said, great, we'll make you the training and outreach coordinator. And so I worked with her. This was my first foray into fundraising. I worked with her to help find funding to support that new position. And then I took that position. And I did that for a little over a year. And then I went back to Angie and said, okay, so now I understand the entry-level program. I understand the next level of recruiting and training and how to get folks prepared to be good, but I don't really understand how you make an ask, a financial ask, how you sit down with a donor or a corporation and say, we need $25,000, or will you support us at $10,000 for 5 years? And honestly, that felt terrifying. But she was kind enough to work with me and start bringing me out on some of her donor meetings to show me how she approaches it and makes the ask, and I learned from her. Then when I took this job here as the ED of CASA of Atlantic and CASA of Lancaster and Lebanon counties, the one area that I never really had experience with was grant writing. But I was able to go way back to my English major days and use those writing skills and those research skills and figure out how to write effective grant applications. So Angie was my first mentor, and I've had numerous mentors since then. I served on the board of the YWCA of Lancaster County and found some mentors in the women who were also on the board of directors there. I found truly mentors on my own board who were willing to share their expertise and kind of guide me along. The need to be flexible and adaptable. I mean, somewhat cliche, but so true. And as I mentioned during my service in AmeriCorps, I don't think there's a truer test that I've experienced of flexibility and adaptability than camping with people you never met for 8 weeks in Minnesota, or living in a one-room bike hostel for 10 weeks in Missouri, or starting a project and catching a plane the next day to go do disaster relief in Florida. And so I think they are skills that can be learned and tested, but they have proven exceptionally well for me in this role. And then the last is vulnerability. I think when I started at any point, particularly as a team leader, but even initially as an ED, I refused to show that I didn't know what I was doing because I was young. I mean, I was 27, 28 when I became an ED, and I was a staff member of one. And I didn't really have leading and organizational leadership experience at the time. And I was fearful that saying that I didn't know how to do something, how to balance a budget, how to do whatever, would further kind of feed into people's ideas that I didn't deserve this position. I didn't know what I was doing. Excuse me. 12 years later or so, I am happy to tell you when I don't know what I'm doing. And I am happy to find the people who can do it for me or with me and teach me along the way, or just turn it over to them completely. And I love watching now my team pick up and fill in my large weaknesses. I have a directors of operation who loves data and loves policy. I love neither of those things. She is exceptional at them. She writes policy for the organization. She runs data reports. She tells me where our gaps are. I have a program director who oversees her volunteer managers and the advocates they serve. And she loves that. And she's great with them. And it frees me up to focus on other aspects of program administration. So I think feel free to follow us and reach out if you have any questions. And I will answer any questions you all have now. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, you mean with an English major? Yeah, I think it was probably the financial side of the organization. I talked about mentors and having people in the right places. I had a phenomenal board treasurer at the time, who was a CPA and did nonprofit audits. And so I sat down with her on multiple occasions to try to understand profit and loss statements and balance sheets and how what I was doing and where our expenditures were reflected back in those. But that was easily, and probably still is, one of my weakest spots.
I have a question about your budget.
Yeah.
The operations, is that predominantly like salaries of the big staff?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah, so the program operations, it's a great question. It's all how we frame stuff, right? Because we're predominantly, well, exclusively a volunteer organization, it is hard to show folks how their dollar then subsequently benefits the children that we serve. But the program expenses would be stuff like training materials for our advocates, recruitment costs, and then my program staff who oversee, supervise, and mentor the 100 and some odd advocates.
Focusing on a specific area of funding or?
Yeah, it's hard. So we do, but not. So I kind of say CASA is like a one-note wonder. We do child advocacy. That is what we do for youth in care. And so for folks who kind of want to see a program innovation, we can explore that, like developing some training specifically to benefit older youth in the system. That is something that fits in with our mission. There's a phrase in nonprofit work, mission creep, where you start to augment what you're doing just to get the funding. Yeah, exactly. And so I'm very careful about that, because I fell into that trap a couple of times early where I was like, hey, we kind of do this, if I write the grant for this, 20% of it can go to our normal operations, and 80% of it will fund this program innovation that this grantor, this donor wants to see happen. And it never works out the way that it's supposed to. And you lose focus on your mission. Sure, it's a great question. Yeah. Yeah. Biggest piece of advice. I think it is finding the organization whose mission really speaks to you. You can't do this work if you're not passionate about it. You just can't. At least I don't think you can. And then I firmly believe that every success of at least my work with CASA has been based on relationships. So how to build relationships, how to maintain relationships. And when I moved here from New Jersey to start this program, I didn't know anybody. And so I had to start from ground zero. Luckily, I had a very engaged board and the steering committee who helped make those initial introductions. But since then, I've forged relationships with some of our top donors, our corporations, and the same thing can be true for our advocates. You have to get to know people. You have to get to know donors, why they give, whether their money or their time or both. And so I think relationship skills. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think so. For me as a leader, the impact of the pandemic and how we were all able to adapt remotely and still get things done. I think to go back to business as usual immediately following that would mean that we didn't organizationally learn anything from the pandemic. And so my team and I continue to enjoy a hybrid work style. What I heard from my folks is that they enjoyed working from home. I enjoyed working from home. And there's benefits to having that opportunity. And so we all recognize a 50% in the office, 50% at home work environment. So that was certainly one of the benefits. I think that it contributed to employee morale and built continued feelings of trust between my staff and I. I don't micromanage them. I don't need to know what they're doing at home. I trust that they're doing their job. And then you say what else? Oh, business as usual. I think where we're struggling with business as usual is we've seen currently a decline in new interest in becoming a volunteer. And it's not exclusive to us. So I spoke with my counterparts in other parts of the state, out in, Allegheny County and Philadelphia County. And we have all seen about a 35 to 38% decrease year over year in new volunteer inquiries. And so I can't tell you exactly why. I can tell you that we've theorized that it's a result of kind of the ongoing pandemic and cultural fatigue of society. And it's not a small ask to be a CASA. We realize it's a high bar. We screen you, we train you for 40 hours, and then you get a case that can be emotionally taxing, mentally taxing, and it's confidential because it's dealing with a vulnerable youth in care. And so it's not necessarily the grounds that are ripe for breeding like relationships, and we don't really have a lot of episodic volunteer opportunities. So I think that is kind of an ongoing barrier for us. Yeah.
Have you tracked anything specific to your net promoter score? Like.
Help me understand that.
About how, the people involved in your organization actually outwardly promote what it is that they do. How they.
Yeah.
Any of that.
So I don't know that we phrase it that way. But I can tell you that our most effective tool of promotion from inquiry to taking a case is word of mouth from an existing volunteer. And it's something we work with our volunteers on because initially through training, we purposefully drill in the concept of confidentiality. You can't talk about with your case with other people. You can't really paint it in broad strokes because Lancaster County and communities are very small. And so you think you're concealing the identity and someone's like, hey, I think that's my neighbor. And so we talk about that. And I think what we learned initially was we talked about it so much that nobody ever talked about what they did at all for fear of breaching confidentiality. And so now we talk a little bit more in training about how to kind of paint the program in broader strokes, work on their elevator pitch. So that's still our most effective of means. Yeah.
For a student who is interested in being involved, what kind of opportunities do you offer?
Yeah. So we certainly offer internships. I'm not gonna lie, they're unpaid, but we're a fun group. So we have internships. We do, historically, quite bluntly, most of our interns have been social work interns. But as we grow, I mean, we're looking for, communications interns, marketing interns. I always say to my team, similarly to how my initial ED helped develop a position to allow me to grow, that one of the benefits of running a small nonprofit is that we can kind of adapt to you. And so I've created positions for my staff, just how positions were created for me. And we've created internships around a student's skills and needs if it's something we need. So I would say if you're interested, you can certainly reach out to myself or to Laura, our ops director, and talk about what it is that you need, and we'll see if it's something that's mutually beneficial. Volunteering, we certainly, as I mentioned, unfortunately lack kind of some of those easy engagement. It's a pretty high bar. We always need more advocates, but you do have to be 21. We do have some kind of one-offs with community awareness days and the gala where we can use some kind of committee help with setting up and checking and that sort of stuff. So if you're interested and or if you need community service hours to graduate, you can certainly reach out and we can put you on our list and make you aware of those opportunities. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.